Hello, I'm Hal Lindsey.
And I'm Cliff Ford, and this is the International Intelligence Briefing.
Well, we've got a very special report tonight, I think, Cliff.
It is kind of special. Well, good evening and welcome to the special report. The battle for Jerusalem, 4,000 years and counting. The most recent effort to hammer out an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians at Camp David collapsed in failure, as have all preceding efforts. The Israelis blame the Palestinians blame the Israelis. Both sides accuse the U.S. of being biased for the other. And the stumbling block, as President Clinton announced at the summit as the summit collapsed, was Jerusalem.
We all know how hard Jerusalem is.
Always it comes down to Jerusalem. And when it does, it stops the peace process dead in its tracks. Why is this one dusty little city in the middle of a tiny country so valuable to both sides? Jerusalem has none of the qualities that explain the founding of a great city. It isn't by a seaport. It isn't on a river. It isn't on a trade route or caravan trail. It isn't on a major natural source of fresh water. It isn't strategically located for military defense purposes. There has been only one reason for the centuries of passion that have been lavished upon it. Jerusalem's earliest history ties it to the realm of the Spirit and God. It was first mentioned in Genesis 14:18-20, circa 2000 BC, as being the home of Melchizedek. He was the mysterious but great priest of the Most High God, to whom even Abraham bowed and gave tithes. Melchizedek city was then called Salem, or peace. After this, it was the home of a fierce people called the Jebusite. Many of these people were giants, standing more than 8 feet tall. Even Joshua and Caleb could not drive them out. So until King David, the city was called Jebus, and Israelites lived there under their rule. David finally defeated the Jebusites with an amazing victory in spite of their heavy fortifications and huge warriors. Psalm 24 records how the Jebusites taunted David and his army and mocked the God of Israel. That was their big mistake. David entreated Israel's God to enable him to defeat them, and he did. So a little over 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, David established it as the eternal capital of Israel by God's command. The city that had been called Jebus and Salem became Jerusalem, the city of peace.
Yerushalayim, as the Jew calls it, is often called the city of David. It was King David of Israel who, on instructions from God, bought a threshing floor for 600 shekels of gold, and this was from Ornan, the Jebusite. Ornan was willing to donate the land, but David insisted wisely on paying the full price for a cleared title for what is today the most strategic 35 acres on earth, the Temple Mount. It was on this site David built an altar and offered burnt offerings, and it was on this same site that his son Solomon was directed to build God's temple. Jerusalem became the one place on earth where God's manifest presence dwelt, in the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple. This is why the city is much more than a plot of earth, or stones, or buildings, or culture, or an ancestral traditions to the sons of Israel. Without Jerusalem, Judaism has no ultimate meaning. Without Jerusalem, Israel's God has no place for meeting with his people. Indeed, without Jerusalem, the chosen people feel there's no validity to their existence. This is almost an impossible burden for any city to bear. Yet this is the burden that is forever a part of the legacy of Jerusalem. And so it has remained for 3,000 years, ever since its founding by Israel's greatest king. Love for this city and all it represents preserved the Israelites as a unique and peculiar people down through the centuries of dispersion. Every year in the homes of the diaspora, Jews the world over, Passover ended with the prayer, "Next year in Jerusalem." In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple completely. The gold that decorated it melted down between the massive stones of the temple itself. For the soldiers to get at the gold inside, they virtually dismantled it, piece by piece. Thus was Jesus' prophecy of 37 years earlier literally fulfilled. He said, quote, "Not one stone will be left standing on another," end quote. The temple, the seat of God's earthly throne, was lost to the Jews. It was now the time of the Gentiles. All that remained was the hope of next year in Jerusalem. Ironically, the city has experienced little of that for which it was named. Peace has been more of a prayer and a hope than a reality. What Jesus predicted about the interim condition of Jerusalem, from its Roman destruction until its return to the Israelites at the time of his second coming, became literally fulfilled. Listen to Jesus' prophecy, quote, "And they, Israel, shall fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled," end quote. Luke 21, verse 24. In Jerusalem's early history, it was caught between the conquest ambitions of the great empires of antiquity. Israel sits in the middle of a land bridge that connects 3 continents. Anyone who wants to build an empire that embraces Asia, Africa, and Europe has to conquer the key span in the middle of that bridge, Israel. And since its capital is Jerusalem, it came in for one siege after another. The Assyrians, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans all in turn sounded their war trumpets at the gates of Jerusalem. God miraculously delivered Jerusalem many times. However, their greatest danger was never from without, but from within. Because of Israel's frequent departure from faith in their God, he brought upon Jerusalem a destruction about which his prophets had long warned them. This happened twice in their history, exactly fulfilling the prophetic warnings they had been given. In the long period since Jerusalem's second destruction by the Romans, the battle for Jerusalem has become the flashpoint of a 4,000-year-old conflict. The age-old family feud between 2 half-brothers whose father was Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac has exploded upon our current scene and dragged the whole world into it. The Arabs are the descendants of Ishmael. They have always believed that the Israelites cheated them out of their inheritance. About AD 622, this deep, age-old resentment became part of a new religion that was started by one of Ishmael's sons, Muhammad. The religion of Islam is intensely woven around the Arab culture and passions. So wherever Islam has been embraced, Ishmael's passionate hatred toward the Jew has been embraced with it. Many years after Muhammad's death, some teachers of Islam began to claim something that would bind the religious passions of all Muslims to Jerusalem forever. A myth was created that Muhammad and his horse were miraculously flown to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem on the night of his death. Muhammad ascended to heaven, according to this, on his horse from the rock on which Abraham had been willing to sacrifice his son. And of course, they believed that the son was Ishmael, not Isaac. Based on this teaching, Jerusalem is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. Only Mecca and Medina are seen as more important. The blood that has been spilled because of this fervent belief is beyond calculation. And yet the past is merely prelude to the blood that is soon to be spilled over this same issue. According to the prophet Zechariah, this ancient conflict between Ishmael and Isaac over Jerusalem will be the fuse that starts the last war of the world. And now that this issue has been made part of both Islam and Judaism, solving it is impossible. Muslims believe to give Israel Jerusalem is to confess that the Quran and the Hadith, the holiest teaching of Islam, are wrong. Israelis believe that to give up Jerusalem is the same as saying their holy Bible is wrong and that all of their sufferings in exile were for nothing. Islam's entire claim to Jerusalem is based on the Quran, despite the fact that Jerusalem isn't mentioned even once in that entire book. By contrast, Israel's religious and historical claim is well documented. The city figures prominently in the Old Testament, being mentioned more than 600 times. On the other hand, the Muslim claim to the city is based on Surah 17:1, which refers ambiguously to Al-Quds, which means the furthest mosque. Surah 17:1 says, and I quote, "Glory be to Allah, who did take his servant for a journey at night from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque," end quote. Many Muslims, especially in the North African countries, do not even know the name Jerusalem. They call it Al-Quds. All Islam's claim to Jerusalem are based on this one reference to the furthest mosque. But what is the evidence to support the position that either the Dome of the Rock Mosque or the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem is the Al-Quds, or furthest mosque, referred to in the Quran?
Well, the Prophet Muhammad died in 632 AD. At the time of his death, Jerusalem was under occupation by the Byzantine Empire. When Muhammad died, there were no mosques in Jerusalem. On the Temple Mount stood a Christian church, the Church of St. Mary of Justinian. For Muhammad to have ascended to heaven on a winged steed, he would have had to ride that horse into a Christian church and ascend to heaven from a Christian altar. Now, that's an unthinkable act to a Muslim.
Well, Cliff, I think you're really right on that one. I mean, it was a little startling as we investigated this to find those facts out, wasn't it?
It certainly was, Hal. It really was.
Well, Cliff, Caliph Omar did not capture Jerusalem until 638 AD, 6 years after Muhammad supposedly flew from the site into heaven. The Dome of the Rock wasn't built until AD 692, after Caliph Omar was dead. The mosque itself wasn't built on the Temple Mount until 711 AD. Another caliph, Abd al-Wad, built it. By this time, Muhammad had been dead for 80 years. Therefore, even the name, the Mosque of Omar, is historically inaccurate. Al-Wad didn't even actually build the mosque. Instead, he converted the ruins of the Church of St. Mary that still stood on the site. The caliph's contribution to the mosque, apart from restoring the original church, was the addition of the dome on top of the building. It was Caliph Abd al-Wad who named the converted church Al-Aqsa, so it would sound like the mosque mentioned in the Quran. It seems obvious that Muhammad couldn't have been referring to Jerusalem as the site of the furthest mosque when he compiled the Quran. The mosque didn't exist for a full 3 generations after his death. In the days of Muhammad, the mosque at Mecca was the most sacred mosque, whereas the mosque located in Medina was known as the furthest mosque. Viewed in the light of true history, the basis of the Muslim claim to Jerusalem is impossible.
Hal, it's really phenomenal what a little research will dig up.
It really is, and it's also scary how powerful a myth can be. Now, to sum all this up, this is what the Jew believes is at stake here. Jerusalem is part of being a Jew, and part of being a Jew is Jerusalem. Without one, the other cannot exist. It is the city of promise. Isaiah predicts that Jerusalem will be the world's capital city during the Messiah's 1,000-year reign on earth. The possession of Jerusalem is viewed as critical to the survival of the Israelites. To the Jew, if Jerusalem ceased to be theirs, there is no longer a reason for the state of Israel. God himself calls Jerusalem his holy city at least 11 times. It is the only city on earth so designated. God declares, quote, "It is the city called by my name," end quote. As I previously mentioned, Jesus said, quote, "Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Jerusalem remained in the hands of the Romans and the Byzantines until AD 638. The invading Muslims drove them out and held the city until the 11th century. It changed hands a number of times after that. Then came the Crusaders. The city was passed back and forth between the Crusaders and the Muslims until the 13th century. Saladin permanently drove out the Crusaders at that time. The Mamelukes of Egypt took over in the 14th century. Jerusalem fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1517. The city was virtually ignored for the next 500 years. Jerusalem became of little importance in the Muslim Turkish Empire. The final stages of Jerusalem's destiny really began when the British General Allenby captured Palestine and Jerusalem in 1917. When the British terminated their mandate over Palestine, May 15, 1948, the Israelites declared the State of Israel. It was only when the Jews returned and wanted Jerusalem that the Muslims suddenly discovered this current all-consuming passion for Jerusalem. History verifies this statement. In spite of nearly 20 centuries of war, conquest, and neglect, the Jerusalem survived, and so did the Jews, confidently praying each Passover next year in Jerusalem. More than 2,500 years ago, the psalmist wrote, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I do not prefer Jerusalem above my chief joy."
Now, according to history, Muhammad didn't see Jerusalem as a place sacred to Islam. Indeed, he issued a prohibition against the practice of facing Jerusalem in prayer. He had originally instituted the practice as part of an effort to convert Jews to Islam. Well, the effort failed, and on February 12, 624, Muhammad issued an official religious edict forbidding observant Muslims from facing Jerusalem in prayer.
The Israelis claim ownership of the city as their historical capital. In other words, they claim right of prior ownership. The Israelis have a legal claim to the city as the spoils of war also. The Israelis captured the city in 1967 when they defeated the invading Arab armies, including Jordan. Israel also captured what was historically Judea and Samaria. Today, it's called the West Bank. When the largely migrant farmers who had been sent to Palestine to prevent Israeli occupation were abandoned by their Muslim countries, the fleeing refugees were shoved into refugee camps by their own Muslim brothers. They were then presented to the world as the Palestinian people. From one of these refugee camps emerged Yasser Arafat, and overnight the refugees were transformed into something not known before, the Palestinian people. Such status was never given them by the centuries of Muslim rule before Israel was born. President Clinton said the Camp David talks failed because the two sides refused to compromise over Jerusalem. Jerusalem was founded, as we said, by King David. God gave title deed to Jerusalem and only to one people, the Jews. Jerusalem is the only city with a place in eternity, according to the Bible. The Arabs say Jerusalem is their holy city, despite the shabby treatment it's historically received at their hands, and because of the lack of any reference to it in the Quran. By mid-19th century, the city was a neglected backwater where Jews were in the majority. Israel refuses to divide the city, claiming it must remain their eternal, undivided capital forever. Yasser Arafat, on the other hand, demands the city be divided and the half with the Temple Mount be given to him for his capital city. Both sides can't be right. King Solomon was once faced with a similar perplexing dilemma. Two women both claimed the same baby. Solomon offered to divide the child in half. One woman agreed, the other refused. Solomon concluded the one with the right to the child is the one who refused to divide it. It will take someone with the wisdom of Solomon to get these two sides to agree on anything where Jerusalem is concerned.
Well, in Europe, the ghettos were beginning to break up under the impact of the scientific revolution sweeping the continent. Now, the ghettos served two purposes in Europe: First, they kept the Jews away from the Gentiles. It was, after all, the Gentiles who forced the Jews into ghettos to begin with. But it served an important purpose for the Jews. It kept them from being assimilated into their host populations. As the ghetto system began to dissolve, their distinct cultural identity was jeopardized. The Jews of Europe had two choices before them: a homeland or cultural extension. For the Jews of the diaspora, any country, no matter how hospitable, would always be galut, Hebrew for exile. Only Israel could be home. At the close of the 19th century, it was perfectly suited to the purpose. It was a sparsely populated, marginal province of the dying Ottoman Empire. The land was populated by groups from a number of religions and seemed to have no national consciousness of its own.
You know, Cliff, this is so often overlooked. The condition that existed in Palestine at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century.
We try to change history, Hal.
Yeah, it's just been rewritten. It really has. As the ghettos began to disappear in Europe, in Jerusalem, Jews living inside Jerusalem began to rebel against the old religious order. They began to hear the call of the land and started forming communities and revived the ancient Hebrew language, which was probably one of the most centralizing facts of all. Hebrew returned to the Jews as living vernacular, and a national renaissance started. It was time, as the prophet Isaiah predicted, quote, "Fear not, for I am with thee. I will bring thy seed from the east and gather thee from the west. I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, keep not back. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth," end quote. The land of Israel responded to the touch of the people of the promise. What was desert 50 years ago, today supplies 95% of Europe's oranges and exports tulips to Holland. The transformation of Israel from desert to wasteland to the oasis it is today could have taken place any time in the last 500 years, years of Muslim rule. Except for this missing ingredient, the land was waiting for the Jews, just as Ezekiel 36 promised it would.
Phenomenal, Hal. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181. That resolution forever changed the status of Jerusalem insofar as the global body politic viewed it. Resolution 181 declared Jerusalem to be a corpus separatum. This is a legal term meaning the body of a separate covenant. By passing 181, the UN declared it has one covenant with Jerusalem and another covenant with the rest of the world. Israel, as a nation, falls under the auspices of the United Nations Charter. Jerusalem, on the other hand, has a special status unique among the cities of the world. It is the only city in the world with such standing. 6 months before there was a state of Israel, Jerusalem was established as an international city under the jurisdiction of the Trusteeship Council. Now, in 1950, the UN passed a document called the Statute for the City of Jerusalem. The UN sets forth its objective to protect and preserve the unique spiritual and religious interest located in the city of the three great monotheistic faiths throughout the world: Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. To this end, to ensure that order and peace, and especially religious peace, reign in Jerusalem.
That's phenomenal, isn't it?
It really is.
That is a factor that I didn't know very much about until we studied it this time.
It just shows you, once again, you used the term myths early, and how they can totally change everything in the minds of people.
Yes, and they become more powerful than the truth.
Yes, they are. Yes, they do.
Well, Cliff, the UN is man's attempt to counterfeit the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ that's promised in the Bible. It even quotes Isaiah's passage about beating swords into plowshares on its New York edifice. But Isaiah was talking about the kind of peace that will be wrought by the Prince of Peace. The UN brings peace at the point of a sword, contradicting the very verse they quote by Isaiah. Just as the Serbs, the UN has spent most of the past 50 years trying to enforce by edict that which God alone can settle. God chose Jerusalem long before Satan attempted to exercise his control over the city of God. As Zacharias explained it, quote, "And the Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, O Satan, even the Lord that has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire?" End quote. God himself claims Jerusalem as his holy city. Satan would reduce it to ashes. But it isn't going to happen just that way, folks. God said it would be as a brand plucked from the fire, rescued from the Holocaust Satan has planned for it. And so it will be. The UN declared it a city separate from the rest of the world, but God declared it his first. And his declaration will, in the end, be the only one that really matters. At the Camp David meetings, the U.S. and Israel supported a plan that would give Yasser Arafat his Palestinian state and his capital in Jerusalem. You'd think that finally Arafat would have jumped at the offer, if peace were truly on his agenda, that is. That solution would have expanded Jerusalem's borders and then redivide the city. The expansion would include West Bank Jewish settlements into the new Israeli city of Yerushalayim, Hebrew for Jerusalem. The new borders would also incorporate Arab villages into the city. That portion would become the Arab capital. The Palestinian parliament would be in the Arab neighborhood of Abu Dis, inside of the Dome of the Temple Mount. This sleight of hand with borders of the city would give the Arabs everything they previously wanted. Arafat turned it down. It was a good thing for Barak that he did. Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Olmert was furious. As he put it, it's either a divided Jerusalem or it is not. Any compromise involving Jerusalem would have failed in the Knesset anyway. Nearly a tenth of Israelis are ultra-Orthodox Jews. Without their support, Barak's government would collapse like a house of cards. If Arafat had accepted the compromise, it is unlikely he would have survived long enough to sign it. The prophet Zechariah said that in the last days, Jerusalem would become a burdensome stone to all nations, and that all who tried to shoulder that burden would be cut to pieces or destroyed. The warning is given to all peoples of the earth. The prophet Daniel prophesied that someone would come up with a workable peace plan. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, it speaks of someone confirming a covenant between Israel and her enemies. The covenant is broken in the middle of a 7-year period through an incursion into the same holy places currently responsible for Camp David's failure. Do you see a pattern here? Today, the only path to peace involved dividing the indivisible. But a form of peace will come, according to the prophets. Somebody will come up with a solution to the thorniest foreign policy problem in the world and history. Hailed as a great peacemaker, he will rise to global power. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration gave most of the land of the Middle East to the Jews. The grant was given to a Zionist Jew named Chaim Weizmann in gratitude for his invention of a synthetic material to make smokeless gunpowder. But after World War I, the British realized the Arabs had all the oil. So at the San Remo Conference in 1923, Churchill redrew the map of the Middle East freehand, dividing whole tribes in half and into different nations in the process. Churchill gave away most of the land promised by the Balfour Declaration to the Jews. With a few strokes of his pen, Churchill unknowingly set in motion most of the conflicts of the Middle East of the 20th century. The prophets tell us that Jerusalem will ignite the chain reaction.
Well, one of Arafat's most effective weapons is the anti-Israeli propaganda campaign. Now, he's been waging this campaign in violation of the Oslo Agreement since the day he signed it. Official Palestinian television recently broadcast a play performed by girls in a summer camp. The play shows the Israelis as thieves of their land and murderers. It begins with a father speaking to his son, Salah, in the field. Salah, why do the settlers take people's land? The father, These settlers, you can't trust them. They take land in order to build tall houses for themselves and will have to move to the street. Father to Muhammad, what is the settlers' goal regarding your land? Muhammad, they want to take my land that I plowed and harvested. Father, those dogs the settlers take but don't give. The father is left alone now working in his field, and a group of armed Israelis enter the stage, one of them dressed as an Israeli soldier. Father, get off my land, leave my land, stop taking people's land. The Israelis wave a sheet of paper and say, listen, it says on this piece of paper that this land is ours. The father yells, the land is my property, and rips up the paper. Well, afterwards, shoving and pushing starts and blows are exchanged. The father says, get off my land. I plowed it and harvested it. The Israelis push him to the ground, shoot him, and then run away. The son Salah returns and says to his father, 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 what did they do to you? Why are you fallen like that? Well, the dying father says, my son Salah, watch over the land, because the settlers want to take the land that I plowed. Well, Yasser Arafat learned his lessons taught by Israel's most successful enemies. This sort of drama is designed to deeply embed a passionate hatred of the Jews in a child's mind. Arafat has the best possible teachers for this sort of psychological conditioning. He is an unabashed admirer of Adolf Hitler and a keen student of his philosophy concerning the Jews. Throughout the 1930s, Adolf Hitler commissioned hundreds of films and plays like The Eternal Jew. They were designed to prepare the average German to accept the final solution of the death camps. It worked for Hitler, and Arafat is betting it'll work for him, Al.
Well, you can bet that he's got a good teacher, because the highly educated German people swallowed all of the propaganda, mostly shot to the emotions like they're doing. It is obvious, even to an amateur observer, that the Palestinian Authority is preparing for war. Just recently, it came out that the Palestinian youth are being trained for guerrilla warfare. They recently acquired 14 mechanized BRD M2 platoons, 50 BTR-52 armored personnel carriers. These are military assault vehicles. They're also preparing for heavier armor. They acquired at least 30 heavy flatbed trucks that have only one basic use: transporting main battle tanks into combat areas. They're not used to transport tour buses. Egypt has hundreds of modern battle tanks near the border of the PA-controlled Gaza Strip. This could be transferred to the PA quickly if war began. The above-mentioned armored personnel carriers are armed with multiple Soviet 50 caliber machine guns. If these were for police work, it would be like hunting mosquitoes with a shotgun. These machine guns pack a punch roughly 3 times that of the US M16 rifle. The Soviets developed the BTR-52 armored personnel carriers from 1950 to 1960, primarily for use by the Muslim clients against Israel. Its effectiveness was proven by the Soviets in Afghanistan, which has conditions very similar to Israel's. It is a perfect fighting vehicle for the terrain and conditions found in Israel. Its speed and firepower make up for its lighter defensive armor plating. It is especially deadly at night. It is equipped with night vision equipment and can carry 20 assault troops at speeds of up to 75 miles per hour in rough terrain. At the PA's unofficial headquarters, the Orient House in Jerusalem, detailed records are kept showing topographical, logistic, military, and population information on strategic Israeli targets. It's certain that all these preparations are not for police work or military parades. Where's the UN protest about this? All of this equipment and training is in direct and specific violation of the Oslo Peace Agreement. In fact, the whole purpose of the present peace negotiations was to prevent the very thing that this is openly going on in front of their noses. So where is the UN protest? Where is the condemnation of the Western nations that are so quick to condemn Israel for infinitely fewer issues? Since Israel has already given 90% of what is promised, where is some sign of at least good faith from the Muslim side? Maybe it's time to remember that before June 1967, the Arab nations already had everything they're asking for now, yet they still launched 3 wars against Israel. Those facts alone ought to wake up someone in Israel and the West as well to reality.
You would really think so, wouldn't you?
There's some rather transparent logic in the facts, I'll tell you.
What can I tell you? Israel's leading rabbis conducted a formal hearing to explore an explosive proposal to construct a synagogue on Temple Mount. Now, at its monthly meeting, the Chief Rabbinical Council discussed the proposal at the request of the Chief Rabbi of Haifa. The proposal, as it stands, failed to win approval, but it has renewed a debate in Israel that has simmered for 2,000 years. There is currently a rabbinical ban in place forbidding Jews to set foot on the Temple Mount. Well, the ban is the result of a kind of circular logic. Jews cannot set foot on the Temple Mount because all living Jews are ritually defiled. The only way to cleanse the defilement under Jewish law requires the restoration of temple worship. The temple doesn't exist, so no ritual cleansing can take place. As momentum builds for a Jewish presence on the Temple Mount, so also does support for rebuilding the temple.
You know, this is really an eye-opening sign, Cliff. This is something that we need to stop, look, and listen at. When the rabbinate start doing these things, it's time to watch.
It really is. It could cause a tremendous amount of trouble, Hal, and I
really
think that's
could.
what you're going to discuss with us.
Yeah.
Discuss with us.
And of course, any talk about rebuilding the temple is an implicit threat against the existing mosques that occupy the original site of the temple. That only serves to increase the likelihood of a coming war between Israel and her Arab neighbors over the city of Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam. The Bible says that during this 7-year tribulation period, the temple, or some form of the temple worship, will again take place on the Temple Mount. 2 Thessalonians predicts the Antichrist will declare himself to be God in the Holy of Holies of the temple of God, thereby committing the ultimate sacrilege. This declaration takes place exactly 3.5 years prior to Christ's second coming. This act, known in prophecy as the abomination of desolation, will launch the most horrific war in the history of mankind. According to prophecy, this war will imperil the very existence of the Israelites. Now, it's obvious that such an important prophetic event cannot take place without a rebuilt temple. The third temple needn't be restored to its original grandeur to qualify. Even a quickly erected temporary temple made according to the ancient measurements would qualify. This recent rabbinic council is the first time in modern history that Israel's rabbinate has even entertained the possibility of an official Jewish presence on the Temple Mount. Bible prophecy clearly reveals that it won't be the last. The prophet Zechariah predicts that in the last days, the whole world will gather against Israel because of a dispute over Jerusalem. Any Jewish attempt to reassert sovereignty over this site would eventually cause exactly what Zechariah predicted. So for the first time in history, everything is in place to fulfill this prophecy.
Well, Hal, Arafat has made it clear that no price short of getting back East Jerusalem will purchase peace between the two peoples. But there is a little known fact. Not every Arab in Jerusalem wants to see the Palestinian Authority take control of the old city. Many East Jerusalem Arabs have begun paying up all their debts to the Jewish Jerusalem Municipal Authority. Many are also bringing their Interior Ministry documents up to date. If a Palestinian state is declared, they'll be able to claim Israeli citizenship instead of being annexed to an Arab state. Senior Palestinian officials believe if the question were put to a referendum, the overwhelming majority of Arabs would vote to remain under Israeli control.
You know, this is one of the most amazing facts that our study brought out and for this report. And that is that, hey, they have prospered under Israeli control and not really been hampered.
Well, just look at the land now that the Israelis control, how it's green, it's
Yes.
fertile,
Yes.
it produces, and look at the way it was, and look at the other side.
Well, you know, the interesting thing, too, and we know a few Palestinians that we love, Christian Palestinians, who do business and have done business under Israeli control. They don't have to pay the kind of taxes that they have to pay under the PA control.
That's very true. That's very true.
Well, Cliff, this just goes to prove the obvious. Most of the Arabs who demand control of Jerusalem don't live there. Those who do would rather live under Israeli democracy than under traditional authoritarian Arab government. This is what makes any negotiations between Israel and the PA all but impossible. Arafat has to not just represent the Palestinian demands, but the demands of the entire Muslim world. And the most vocal demands are from the fanatical Islamic regimes which want absolutely no compromises whatsoever. But the coming battle for Jerusalem won't be about who would govern best. In the majority Muslim worldview, no city at all is preferable to a Jewish-controlled Jerusalem. That is something that eludes the Western diplomats trying to solve a deeply rooted religious problem with political tools. And it all but guarantees the issue will still be on the table when the false peacemaker, the one we know from biblical prophecy as the Antichrist, takes center stage. And I don't believe that's far off. Jerusalem, the city of peace, has known only war for most of the last 2,000 years. Between the wars, its various invaders occupied it. When not being contested in battle, its occupiers and the world at large mostly ignored it. By the 19th century, many Westerners didn't know if it still existed as a real city. Today, it is headline news on an almost daily basis. Now, most Americans know more about Jerusalem than any other foreign city. This is exactly the way the Bible predicted it would be, thousands of years in advance. The same prophets also predicted the coming of a peacemaker. Those prophecies were dependent on the fulfillment of Jerusalem's unlikely position on the world's center stage. Jerusalem is exactly where it should be in the last days, a powder keg, both politically and spiritually. The powder keg of the Middle East is tailor-made for Daniel's predicted peacemaker. Now, the Apostle John spoke of this coming peacemaker in the book of Revelation, and he called him the rider on the white horse. He's the first of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. John sees him with a bow, the symbol of war, but no arrows. Daniel says that by means of peace, he shall destroy many, end quote. The stage is set for this peacemaker's unveiling. Those who reject God's prophetic word will have no clue as to who this person really is. He will mesmerize the unbelieving world into euphoric belief that he has finally brought the long-awaited millennium of peace. But this is pseudo-peace, and it will fade like a snowflake in the sun. Islam and Judaism's fiery passions for Old Jerusalem will explode again into war, and it will escalate to global proportions. The world will be so devastated within 3.5 years that only the return of Christ can save mankind from extinction. He will have to immediately reset the earth's ecology so that it can sustain life. Those who survive this terrible period will immediately be gathered outside the walls of Jerusalem in the valley that is then called Jehoshaphat. They will be judged according to whether they believed in the Lord Jesus or not. Those who did will go as mortals into the new millennial kingdom over which Jesus will reign. They will experience the greatest period of peace, prosperity, security, and blessing ever known on this old planet. And Jerusalem will be the center of the world. Jerusalem will finally realize all the dreams and hopes that past generations looked for. And the only city to be called God's city will be the place where he dwells among men. And his name will be called at that time Jesus, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the eternal Son of the living God. The battle for Jerusalem is 4,000 years old and counting. You know, it's time, whether you're Palestinian, whether you're Arab, Gentile, or Jew, to come to the real point. And that is, the solution is not political. It's to come to a personal faith in Jesus Christ. He paid the penalty for all of our shortcomings that would unqualify us for God's acceptance. Now, you can't deserve or earn this pardon. You can only receive it as a free gift. But you must claim it by an act of your will, or else it's not valid for you. Right now, wherever you are, just bow your head and receive your pardon for sin. Just tell Jesus that you're willing for him to come in and to make your life what he wants it to be. He's the Son of God, and he loves you. And in an instant, he will change your eternal destiny. You're forgiven all your sins in that moment. Jesus comes to live in you and give you a new heart with new desires. Don't put this off. Do this right now. You may be left behind to face the most horrible period of tribulation the world has ever known. God loves you, and he will give you assurance that you have entered his eternal family.